Hi everyone, Tia here from Order of the Bookish. Thank you so much for joining into our Author Talks interview. Today we have Clyve Rose, author of The King's Mistress. She is a historical fiction romance writer, and I actually have her book right here. I love her cover because it's, a little bit mysterious. We see the main character. She's running away in this big, beautiful burgundy dress. And Clyve, I have to know what's going on here. I did start reading already, so I have a little idea, but I really want to know more about your book and about your writing inspiration.
Well, she actually does wear a burgundy dress later on in the story. But actually she's running away from a marriage arranged by her father, and she doesn't want to wed the man he's picked for her because he is a friend of her father's. He's old, he's also rather brutal, and he attacks her, thinking that he'll take what's going to be his anyway because he's drunk and he feels like he can. And on the heels of this, she already has heard unpleasant things about him. He's buried his third wife in as many years. She doesn't really want to be his fourth. So she disguises herself and takes off, hoping to reach the coast and get a boat to France where her older brother is. And she's hoping that she can set up house with him or that he will take her side, whatever. She just wants to go away. So that's what she and actually the first time the hero sees her, or the second time he sees her, she's just riding cloaked on a horse through the mist, and he doesn't actually know much about her, except that in order to protect herself, she decides it would be smart to pretend that she's someone's mistress, because then people think she's got a protector. And she decides on the Romany king because she knew him when she was a young girl. He stayed at her family's estate because he was a friend of her brother's, and she liked him. He doesn't recognize her, though, because she was a child then, and now she's a young woman with curves and all of that. That's basically what she's doing, running through the mist to escape. Well, she wants to get to Paris, but with the naivety of a girl in the 1820s, she doesn't really know how terribly dangerous such a journey on her own will be. She does believe that she needs the spectre of a man behind her in order to preserve her virtue and whatnot. So that's why she makes up the lie she does, because he's the last decent man she remembers knowing, apart from her brothers.
Wow.
And she's always had a bit of a crush on him. And when he finds out that there's this woman running around the countryside claiming to be his mistress, he thinks, that's interesting. I go and see why this person is who thinks that they are my lover and find out if that's something I want to be a part of.
And yeah, as the king, I'm sure that's a little bit scandalous for him that he suddenly has a mistress running around the country telling everybody who she is.
Yeah, he's the king of the Romany that travel around Lancashire. So it's not quite the same as a British royal, but they have their own traditions, and it would be very inappropriate. While he clearly has a thing for Gaggia women, as in women who are non-Romany, and actually uses those relationships to further the interests of his people, it would be terribly scandalous if he had a full-on relationship with one and in fact fell for one, because it would put his people under threat, and they're already under threat in Regency England, where even talking to a Romany or Gypsy, as they were called then and sometimes still are, could get you hanged. But because of his connection with some of the great houses and his relations with their women and their husbands sometimes, because he also trades in horses, he's very interested in racing, and he had some success with his British partners. So he's more respected than he otherwise might be, but he is known as a man who can be a little tough when it counts and quick with the spit.
One thing I do want to bring up is, the sheer amount of research that you've done, not just in, reading, because we've talked a little bit before this and your interest in classical stories, but also just like researching for this particular novel. You have even put in recommended reading into your book so that readers who are interested in this genre or in this time period can do their own at-home research. So tell me a bit more about like your researching journey for this book.
Well, I started researching in Jane Austen's Emma, in I think chapter 38 or 39, there's an incident where one of the secondary characters, Harriet, Emma's best friend, is attacked by gypsies. And she's the way Austen writes of them upset me. I understand the time she was writing in, but I didn't like it. They treated as criminals, and she comes within a bee's whisker of calling them heretics and whatever. And she clearly believes that they're an underclass and a criminal class. And not surprising. I mean, they show up in literature from that time in that way, but that's because none of that literature was theirs. But the fact is that Romany people have been in England since the 1500s. It's a shared land. It's their land as much as it is a white Christian Austenite. And I wanted to, the main character in Always a Princess, which is the book before this one, grew straight out of my anger around that. And then I started looking at the interplay between the English families and these people and the Romany people, and how that might impact and the differences between them. But I mean, they do have some things in common. They both want the best for their families. They just have very different ideas about how that comes about, and they have completely different value systems. They would never believe in owning land the same way that the British do, and therefore the idea of trespass doesn't make sense. But these are English laws that are hemming them in, and that's happened throughout England and Europe for that matter. The Romany, more and more of their way of life has been legislated away because the way they live suddenly isn't allowed. Suddenly you're not allowed to travel from place to place. Suddenly you can't just set up wherever. And there's all sorts of half-baked solutions for how to manage this in places where they're trying. But the fact is that they've ended up as footnotes on the pages of history, mainly because they're barely remembered as there. But I have some Roma history, and I felt that quite deeply. I also have Jewish ancestry, and my family lost an entire branch during the Holocaust. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but over 500,000 Romani were sent to the camps and murdered, as well as the 6 million Jews and the 20 million Russians and all the ones everyone knows about. People often forget that the Romani were persecuted too. So I felt like there was a connection there to my own family, and I wanted to foreground that, the voices that people forget, basically.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that you're taking, something from your own life. And even though it's fiction, it is, very much reality. That's why it's historical fiction, but like not even just historical fiction, but like historical to you and your life as well. And I'm sure if it applies to you, then it applies to millions of other people as well.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to constantly be aware of how you don't belong in a place where you've always been. It's not like the Romani suddenly showed up in England last week. They've been there for centuries. So to be treated like you don't belong all the time when you were born there, when it's your place, it's your home, it's your land as much as anyone's, it's just you don't have you're not the dominant culture. And I think there's a lot of people who have a history or a link in their family that might understand that. And constantly having to bend pieces of yourself to fit. It hurts to do that. You damage yourself. You damage your view of yourself. In The King's Mistress, Balkan, the Romani king, makes a point where he realizes how unsafe Lydia, the heroine, feels around just about anyone, but especially men. And he thinks it's never occurred to him to wonder how to make an English person feel safe before, because he's never thought it was an English need. He's always thought it was a Romani one. The need to feel safe and to feel a sense of home and a sense of place. And I think that's interesting because, of course, if you were born there, it's your place, but it doesn't always feel like it, especially when you're constantly told you don't belong, which is something that the heroine experiences on an individual level, but the Romani experience as a people all the time.
Yeah.
Which might be
So they do have that shared, thing in common. I'm sure they have plenty of other things in common as well. But that is something very deep that, probably bonds them together faster than they realize.
Mm.
So one thing
Uh,
I do also want to bring up is, just kind of adding into the sheer amount of research that you've used for this book is the names. So on your 8th page, and I have it right here, your glossary of Romany terms, there are so many terms here, so many names that, just glancing at it feels a little overwhelming because it's essentially, it looks like it's a whole different language. And I don't recognize any of these words at all. So how did you come about, finding these and using them
mm,
properly?
Most of them come from a manuscript I found, which is it's a Lil, a word book, a Romany English dictionary it's dated from 1865. I've made a copy of it because the one I found was in an old bookshop and it wasn't very together. And I keep it, but I don't use it very much because I honestly don't think it will stand much longer. But I copied it all, and a lot of it comes from there. I was very careful to try and use, where possible, the terms that were found in England only, or England as well as elsewhere, because the Romani are throughout Europe. You've got Spanish Romani, you've got my own family Roma is Russian, so it's not UK. And then the Irish is slightly different again. And then, you've got Spanish, you've got Russian, you've got another one that's quite well known is the ones from Eastern Europe, Transylvanian, and all over that. There's a whole mysterious connection to the whole Vlad thing. And vampire is a completely different genre, more your very, very much your horror fantasy. But the Romani traveled throughout Europe. So I wanted to keep the words I used where possible, where I could trace it back to the English version of the language, where possible to Lancashire itself, which was a duchy for a long time on the west coast of what is now the UK. But it's not very easy to do because it's an oral language and it's constantly changing and evolving, and it rarely gets written down. It's been written down mostly by non-Romani people, so you can't always be sure that what they've written down is correct. Not unlike ancient Hebrew, which is something I'm a bit more familiar with, but it's not that different. And some of the words actually were quite similar to that. They did. A lot of people know Romani are referred to as gypsies, and that's because in the olden days they thought of them as foreigners from Egypt. But they've since done DNA testing and found that they have far more in common with people from northern India. So some of their words are similar to some Sanskrit words. I learned quite a bit of Sanskrit. Sanskrit in my early school days was something that they had.
Not an easy language.
No, look, I wouldn't say I did it well, but I can see some similarities in the way the words are created. And that's just an interest I have. Being neurodivergent, once I get into a research rabbit hole, I follow it forever. Like I could research all the time and never write a word. It's clear that when the Romani are talking to each other, I hope it's clear that they're speaking in Romani and I'm writing in English. But I do try to pepper a few words in there. For example, if they swear, they're going to swear in Romani. That's what you do. My French friends swear in French, even if they're speaking in English. It's just what you do, because usually when you swear, there's a reason. You're annoyed, you're frustrated, you just drop something on your foot. You're going to use the nearest word that comes to you, and you're not going to use it with any grace.
Yeah.
So that's how it is.
Yeah, you're going to use your mother tongue.
Yeah, true to character. My grandfather always used to swear in Yiddish. That was his one. So,
Fun.
And I think it's, and obviously their names, and a lot of the Romani names are usually just words. The dog's name is, I think his name means thief. I can't remember, but his name is a Romani name. All their horses have Romani names. Some of their children are just named after flowers, but the Romani name for that flower. And that was very common. And the name of the family, Brishen, is connected to storms and rain, and that's because the Lancashire weather is so atrocious, and also because they're pretty fiery. They all have some temper there.
I love how everything in your book is just, so accurate, from the history to, human psychology, to the way people, actually are. When you said that when they curse in their own language, that is so accurate to present day that people reading that would actually be able to relate and think, oh, my grandpa curses in Yiddish, or my partner curses in Spanish, even when they're talking in, English. So you revert back to your mother tongue. And I love how you're incorporating not just history, but also like things that we can today relate to, even names. You know, we have so many names nowadays that are actually just objects, like the name Luna. I had a dog named Luna, and Luna is the moon. And that happens so often. You have names of people who are named after countries, named after states, named after flowers. So again, that's something that people even today can relate to, even though this is a historical novel. That's very interesting. And this is not your only book. I would like to talk about the other book that you have.
Okay. My publisher asked me to write a holiday novella. So I've written 1 year after the events in The King's Mistress. I've written in the book, which you wouldn't have come across him yet, but the youngest Romany brother's name is Charles. He makes a very brief appearance in the first book, and he has a bit more of a role in the second book, because a lot of the second book takes place in the Romany camps. You get to meet a lot more of those characters and see them in their camp doing their work, because the Romany king is obviously in his camp doing his work. And these are his siblings. And of course, they're in his face and they tell him off and they argue with him and they do what siblings do. I have a brother and a sister. And honestly, I can count on one hand the number of conversations we have that don't end in some form of one-upmanship or debate. Again, I don't think people change very much over the people are people, siblings are siblings, parents are parents. It is what it is. And so the novella is the story of him and his betrothed, and it ends with a prologue to book 3, which comes after The King's Mistress is An Impossible Duchess, which is the third one, the Duke's third son, his actual heir, who comes home to manage the duchy. I've got a nice ending for the Duke. He will die in the cellar of a brothel in Paris.
Love that for him.
As one does when one is my bad guy.
I love that so much. So I do want to jump into a little bit of your inspiration. So you were talking about Jane Austen earlier. I know you and me have discussed Frankenstein. It sounds like, as far as your reading material and your inspiration from other novels, it's coming from classics. Can you tell us a little bit more about, how you got into the classics? What are your favorites, least favorites?
I love the classics. And when you were talking about my research, I have to say a lot of my research, when I was learning to research to build a world, I'm one of those nerds who read all the notes in the back of all the Tolkiens. Because those who don't know, Tolkien was an anthropologist before he was an author, or while he was an author. And I think that's very obvious when you read his books.
They're not easy.
Like I tried to get my brother to read Lord of the Rings, and he was like, actually, it wasn't that bad once I skipped the songs.
Oh, no.
You're like, it's like half the book, D. And he was like, yeah, but it saved me so much time. He has a point, though, right? But there's a lot of songs in the King, like that all shows up in my stories, especially because if you're trying to convey a culture, that is the culture. The food, the songs, the swear words, the way they interact, which is different, and it's a culture that not a lot of people are familiar with. So if you're going to show it, that's the part that you have to show people. That's the part that I think certainly the part that I think was interesting, and that's something you don't get a lot of in the contemporary novels of the time. I have read all the Austens. My favorite Austen is Persuasion. I live in hope that one day someone will bribe Henry Cavill to read the letter from the end of Persuasion into a tape recorder that I can play forever on my phone. My personal wish for the world.
As your ringtone, your alarm.
That's right. It won't get me out of bed. And I do think it's a scandal he hasn't done an Austen. I really do. I also read the modern ones. I'm a huge Julia Quinn fan. I met her last year.
Really?
No, this year in June. I met her at the Australian Romance Readers Association event. I got to put that book into her hand. That was exciting.
That's exciting.
I don't want to hassle her, but I hope she's read it and I hope she liked it. I don't want to talk about her too much because she's not one of my publishers' authors. I also, when it comes to, I started off at the very beginning when I was trying to learn how to construct a good story with I started with ancient Greek texts. The Iliad.
An odd research method. Who does that? Who researches ancient Greece each agreed to write a book?
The thing is, you get a lot of our information for those cultures comes from those stories. So I wanted to see what in those stories made them worth reading and listening. And that's where our modern version of storytelling comes from anyway. But also, I mean, that's a journey story. Every road trip every road trip is a version of the journey. There's the Iliad and there's the
Odyssey,
the Odyssey,
yeah.
the Odyssey. Every road trip is a version of the Odyssey, because that was the first road trip in Western culture that we know of. Actually, yeah. So, and when you want to find out, what's interesting to me is how it's quite clear that the people who wrote those stories believed in their gods. Like, we look at the gods as myths now, but in those days they were real to those people.
Yes.
So how did they write that? And when I was talking to my copy editor about The King's Mistress, we talked about how heaven and hell, when they say something about heaven or hell in the story, occasionally they swear, or they one of the Romani swear words is Bengako, which is literally hell. But when they are referring to heaven or hell, I asked her to use a capital because they were real places to those people. They weren't concepts. They were places that you went when you died, and they were real, because these are church-going people in the 1800s, if they were English, or some of the Romani are Christian too. But my point is, they were real places. They were heaven is as real to them as Paris, so you give it a capital H. And same with hell, is as real as London or Lancashire or anywhere else, because that's how they believed. And I learned all of that from Homer and all of that. So, and the same thing, and you can see that in Austen as well, when they talk about punishment and all of it. That was very important, because that was a huge part of their belief system. And while it's fragmented for a lot of people now, it wasn't back then. It was, the church was a big deal. Again, Austen is a clergyman's daughter, and she writes like someone who was raised to believe all of that was real. Just because I don't believe it doesn't mean my characters don't. So I write differently. I write from the perspective of someone who believes that, then I have to make it sound like they believe it.
Yeah. And that's such a, like, as a reader, if I was reading through it, I'd probably notice, oh, the word heaven comes up with capital H, and then it would probably like flip through my head right after. But I think that's such an interesting thing, and I'm so glad you brought it up here in this interview. So anyone who's interested in reading your book, once they see it, while it might flip through their head quickly as they're reading it, now they're going to understand, oh, there's a very intentional purpose to capitalizing these words. And it's because your character, fully realizes or fully believes that this place is legitimately real, like Paris, like London. And there's a reason why it's capitalized. And I think, I really want to know, is there anything else in your book that, is similar to that, where like it's kind of minor, like it might flip through our reader's head, but you did very intentionally?
That's a good question. In the novella that I just finished, that's going to be called A Holiday Season at Clifton Hall, where it's actually, for a 30,000 word story, which is very short, it has a death or funeral, sort of, a wedding, a small court case, and a Christmas feast, which is quite a lot in a tiny little book.
Yeah,
and the prologue to the next story. And I put an Easter egg at the end where the Duke's heir makes his very drunken appearance at the Christmas feast.
There always has to be one very drunk person at the family gathering.
At least. I mean, it was in the Regency era. I don't know if a lot of people know this. They didn't drink water very often because the water wasn't clean. So if you were wealthy, you usually drank alcohol or tea. And they had a thing called a small beer or a spruce beer, which Jane Austen mentions in her letters. And actually, I've got a recipe for it. I put it on my blog somewhere. But basically, even children drank small beer, which was a very lightly alcoholized beer, basically. But you would have 9-year-old kids drinking their little beer and getting. I mean, is it any wonder people ended up bonking in the bushes half the time? I mean, they didn't have underwear either. Underwear was a new concept, but definitely the women didn't. Some of the men
I'm not even surprised. Even today, like if you're comparing Europe to America, Europeans are much more open about, introducing alcohol to, it's legal to drink at 18, and then it's very common to drink or start drinking with the family at family gatherings, even younger than that. Whereas in America, we're like, no, you can't drink until you're 21. So I'm not even surprised that, way back in the day, they were doing it even younger.
Yeah, well, the legal age in Australia for drinking is 18. The legal age for consent for sex is 16. So that's interesting, I've always found. Especially when you're young, and alcohol, at least in Australian culture, often plays a part in that. It shouldn't necessarily, but it often does play a part in that experience. And like, can't drink then. I mean, you can actually, you drink, you can't buy alcohol. Doesn't mean you can't consume it. Like a lot of kids have shandies when they're young and stuff. That's very common here, especially in the summer. I have a 12-year-old and she's not even allowed to have lemon, lime and bitters. So I actually don't drink that much, but I'm very interested in the Regency, the ratafia, which is the drink they made for ladies at balls. If you make it using the proper recipe and you soak your almond kernels, I don't know, almond kernels contain hallucinogens.
Oh.
If you made it according to the proper recipe, it's no wonder people after balls ended up doing weird and wild and wonderful things with.
I feel like that explains quite a bit.
They left that right out of Bridgerton, but wouldn't it be interesting? Phoebe and Simon in the garden.
I'm gonna have to reread the books and see if there's any like hints in there. Interesting.
Yeah, there's a cocktail maker that I follow on Instagram. I feel like sending it to him saying this takes like 2 months to make. You think you can have a go? I want to know what it does, but I don't want to do it myself. I feel like a man should do this, I don't do anything stupid. Yeah, so and I research all of these things, and I feel like I need to know it, even though it doesn't make an overt appearance in the story. I work with a writing mentor, and she's very good, and she's like, you need to know you know it, but your reader doesn't need to know everything you know. And honestly, she spends my first version pretty much pulling out stuff that she's like, you don't need any of this. And that's partly an anxiety thing for me. I need to be confident that I am delivering an otherworldly experience, an escapist experience for my reader. I think people read for different reasons. Some people read to look for someone just like them. Some people read to escape. And I both read and write to escape. And I think the readers I mostly connect with are the ones who read for the same reason.
Yeah.
I even have a friend who said, she read my early books and she wouldn't read this one. I said, why? And she said, because when I read your books, I fall into the story and I can't think of anything else and I get nothing else done. So I'm sorry, but no. I'm like, I'm going to take that as a compliment.
I think that's
she didn't mean it as one, but I'm taking it as one.
That's a very polite, sort of passive-aggressive compliment, I think.
Yeah, well, she's basically saying that it messes with her head. She doesn't want to do it. I get that. I do. I have the same reason I can't read a Stephen King book. I scare very easily, and I haven't got a very good visual mind. But if I read a description of something, it stays in my head forever. Really don't want that with a lot of Stephen King. Although I'm very tempted. That Holly one looks really good. But yeah, I scare easily. So no, I've read excerpts and I can see he's a wonderful writer.
Yeah.
Don't want to read any. And I have a thing about clowns. I really hate clowns. I'm
not a big horror thriller fan, so I haven't touched any of his books. I don't watch the movies. I stay away. It's interesting to hear about, but yeah, I like to sleep at night, so I stay away.
Yeah, I'm not a fan. My daughter loves horror. She's just written her first mystery horror novel.
Okay.
It's pretty good. Yeah, I know. It's YA. They had to do an assignment for school, and they had to do something creative that took them the whole semester. And I didn't even know she was working on it. She came over and she said, "Can you edit my book?" I'm like, "Okay, I think you're going to be like 2 pages." It's longer than some of my novellas. I'm like, awesome, I'll get onto that now. But it is actually quite cleverly plotted. I'm quite impressed. So when it comes to research, I tend to do way more than I ever use. I spent 2 weeks once working out for the Christmas Salon, actually. This one, that's a different book. Oh, there it is. No,
I got it. Yeah, there we go.
I spent 2 weeks working out because It's set in 1814, which is just before the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars, which occurred in 1815. Napoleon's in prison, and they're all worried he's going to escape and raise another army in March, which is exactly what happened. And I spent ages working out how hard it would be for the hero of the story to ride from Vienna to Paris to find the woman he loves. Because the borders were moving around a lot at the time, they were just redrawing the map of Europe. That's what the Congress of Vienna was all about, where he's at representing England, and he has to go to Paris to find this woman. And I'm like, where would he go? How would he go? How long would it take? He's riding a horse in winter. There's snow on the ground, all that sort of thing. It took me 2 weeks to work out a probable route, looking at the borders, the changing borders of Vienna and Paris and France and all sorts of things. And then that entire scene, I cut it. I'm like,
oh,
spent 2 weeks going, this is the way he'd go. These are the problems he'd have. This is how long it would take him. I'm like, no, it can't happen. I need him to be in Paris by this date. He can't do that and make that journey. Now, would a reader have written to me and said, I know this is the problem that you have in your story? I don't know. But I would have known it was wrong, and that would have bothered me.
Oh gosh. And that's so frustrating and heartbreaking to, I did that with my own book, to just write so much and get so into it just to realize the story would be better without it. Yeah.
I'm sure I will use that research again. In fact, I mean, half of this new book that I'm working on, An Impossible Duchess, takes place in Paris. In France. So I will probably use that research again. But I did find out a great website that tells you how fast it would take a horse to travel a certain distance without harming the horse. Because a lot of historical fiction writers who don't get that right, and they'll go, they rode from here to here in such and such a time. And they're like, if your person's a hero, they can't ride their horse to death. That's not a heroic thing to do in a historical novel. The villain could, sure. Or the valet could do it and get told off, but he can't because he's the hero.
Yeah.
And then there's like, well, what if you did it in a carriage? How would that work? And so this website lets you look at a man on horseback, a team of horses, and, whether or not a carriage could do it based on what we know of the roads. And that's really helpful.
Very interesting.
So very much bookmark that website. Whatever you want to know, someone somewhere has done a thing on it, and you can just read their research. And yeah,
that makes things easier, so you don't have to do that math yourself.
Yeah, except that then I have to convert it for my own understanding to kilometers. But now that I actually have a cheat sheet that shows how fast a horse can travel in a day, so that when I'm looking at the distance between two towns, in the novella, the Christmas novella that I've just finished, there's some travel between Yorkshire and Lancashire and Clifton Hall, which is in Lancashire. And I had to look at those distances and see how far they could go and how long it would take them and whether they'd be on horseback or pulling a carriage and things like that. And again, I don't know if a reader would be annoyed if I got that wrong, but I would. I would be annoyed. Particularly as the Romany are incredibly skilled on horseback. You can't have an incredibly skilled rider on horseback taking forever to do something that he should be able to do much more quickly, because that's how you've described him. It's inconsistent. So.
But I think it's very smart that you do all this incredibly deep research, even the moments when you're not actually using that research in the book, because it is putting you in the situation where you fully understand all of your characters, the way they live, the way they grew up, the history around them, everything from like start to finish, their entire lives. You understand them on a personal level, which means that's going to reflect back on your writing. So readers, as I'm reading this book, I'm going to feel like, oh, I'm actually living in this time period, rather than it being like a sort of modern twist on a time period. I'm going to like be fully immersed because you've done all this immaculate research, even if you're not using the little nuanced things like the almond and the tea and stuff like that.
I hope so. I mean, that's my goal. I also talk to a lot of reenactment groups, and they're fantastic. In Always a Princess, the book before this one, Valken the Romany, he's a Romany prince in that one. He's not the king yet because his dad's not dead. He gets shot. And I spent a lot of time talking to reenactment people about how to have him shot, but without permanently maiming or killing him, because I knew I was going to write another story with him, and he needed to be well enough for all of that.
Yeah.
And I needed something that only took a certain amount of time to heal because, yeah, so that's a plot thing. But the Romany don't usually stay in one place, but they are staying here because he's healing. How long will that take? How long do I need for the two characters to fall in love? What can I achieve in that time? I don't know if people are aware that in Pride and Prejudice, that whole book from start to finish, where she can't stand the sight of him to where she realizes he's exactly what she needs. And he actually falls in love with her quite early on, doesn't even realize it's happening. But the whole story takes place over a year, more or less. They even say that she mentions it towards the end that it's been nearly a year. And yeah, I always think about the time span. And I once read that in Wuthering Heights, which is written by Emily Bronte, that someone made a spreadsheet of the timings of when everything happens, and she got it like so. She'd clearly done that, not a spreadsheet, obviously, in 1800s England, but she had clearly timelined everything out because it's exactly, you can track every event back perfectly. There's no plot holes around her times.
I need to find that. Yes.
Wow. So I wanted to make sure I didn't do that in mine.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I do. I mean, these are books that people have admired for centuries. And I'm like, well, I could do worse than take a lesson from these guys. And Emily Bronte is one of my favorite authors, even though I have to say it took me a long time to appreciate her story. I read it when I was 9, and I've got to say I didn't understand half of it. I read it again years later, and it's one of my favorites. There's several books I reread every year. That's one of them. Persuasion's another.
Thank you so much for, sharing all this with us. Your book, both books, all 3 books sound absolutely incredible. The amount of time and love and dedication and research that you've put into these is so incredible and inspirational. And I'm so happy that you shared it with us. Thank you so much. I definitely have to have you back very soon because there's so much more for us to talk about. I love your love for classics and how it's influenced your writing and your life. And I definitely want to hear more. So Clyve, thank you so much for telling us about yourself, about your writing inspiration, about your books. And thank you guys so much for watching and tuning in. I will leave all the information that we've talked about in this interview in the caption. So go ahead and check it out, find those links, support this author, buy her books. And thank you so much, everybody. Happy reading. Bye-bye.